So Dmitri, welcome. We're very grateful that you're participating in this seminar, and I hope that many people will be able to listen to this presentation. So Dmitri, it's up to you.
All right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Chan. Is this Chan?
Chan,
for organizing this. I'm really very glad to be able to join you all. I think it's a great idea to record all these discussions, put them online so that other people could watch and make comments. And in general, Andrew, I think it's extremely timely that we go back to try to understand and rethink the whole idea of socialism, especially in light of the current political, economic, and also ecological challenges. And so today I will be discussing a little bit the so-called NEP, or New Economic Policy, Новая экономическая политика, in Russian, which starts in 1921. And this, as Andrew said, is an extremely interesting period, not only in political life in Russia in particular, but overall. I think 1920s is the most fruitful and productive time for politics, for philosophy, for social sciences, for literature, art, film, and so on. Now, this particular topic might have a kind of narrowly described social and political and historical span, to which I will turn in a moment. And yet I think it is still worth looking into it, because this is the moment when everything seems to be possible, yet, you know, unlike early 30s, especially late 30s, when everything kind of closed, when the system of Stalinism becomes dominant and nothing else happened. So in particular, we need to look at the historical background. This is March 1921, when the country, Soviet Russia, is out of 7 years of very bloody war, First World War and Civil War. Yeah. So one, in fact, followed the other. Now, the revolution of 1917 was in large part kind of triggered by the First World War. And then the next 4 years were very, very bloody civil war with many different armies advancing on mostly European part of Russia in the civil war. And it only, in some places it's ended actually in 1922. But by the beginning of 1921, it was largely over. Now, an interesting thing to note here would be the date, formal date of the introduction of the so-called NEP, or New Economic Policy, which happened in the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party of the Bolsheviks, which was on March 14th, 1921. Excuse me. Now, just a week before that, on March 7th of 1921, there is a so-called Kronstadt Rebellion in a small town of Kronstadt, which is a naval base, very close to St. Petersburg. If you go there, you can still see on the houses, in the streets, certain the marks of the shells and bullets. Now, the whole situation reflects kind of deep unrest in the country, which until 1921 practically was at war, whose army was several million people still fighting on the front of a very vast front in this very vast country. And of course, these people had to be supported, you know, by bread. Bread was one of the main items on the agenda, because most of the soldiers on both fronts, but especially in the Red Army, were peasants, as most of the soldiers in the First World War. They were prevented from producing what they usually used to produce, provision, mostly bread. Before 1914, Russia had a huge export mostly in grains. Yeah. Now these people were not able to do that. And essentially by the beginning of 1921, there was a famine, there was a very widespread malnutrition. There was not enough of industrial production. It was in ruins. A lot of national wealth was taken by the occupation armies and sort of brought abroad. So big industry practically didn't exist. Agriculture didn't function properly, so it was really deep crisis. Now, in order to feed this huge army, the new government had to do something, and the kind of policy they established was called war communism, which is mentioned just about everybody who speaks about by Lenin, Bukharin, Trotsky, and others. And it was not really communism. So the idea was so-called продовольственная разверстка, which meant simply expropriation of the product of agriculture that peasants produced at the time. Now, Lenin, in his speech to the second council of so-called Politprosvet, was political enlightenment. There were people who were supposed to kind of spread the ideas of new politics and bring them to the masses, which was later in October 1921, speaks about it and calls it our mistake. Because the so-called war communism, as Lenin thinks or says, was thought to introduce the idea of communist distribution, which would not involve any market at all, directly. So Lenin says that it was thought that the peasants would produce enough bread, and this bread would be given to the workers, and the workers would produce industrial goods, which will then be redistributed to the peasants, which didn't happen. And so the so-called продразверстка, or продовольственная разверстка, which meant simply expropriation of food produced by the peasants, was a very heavy burden on them. In some cases, up to 70% of the production of the peasants was simply expropriated, sometimes in a very brutal way. Sometimes the peasants themselves were left with not enough food for themselves, not enough grain for the next year. And this led to mass uprisings, which happened in the Urals, in Siberia, in the southern part of the country. And the most important, the most famous was so-called Antonovsky мятеж, Antonovsky восстание, Antonov Rebellion of 1920-1921, which was in the southern part of Russia, around the region of Tambov. Antonov was their leader, who used to be a social revolutionary, and people actually rebelled, peasants rebelled against this forceful expropriation of the majority of the product they produced. Now, it's also noteworthy that this uprising was very brutally there was very brutal suppression under the leadership of Tukhachevsky, who was also the one who was behind the suppression of the Kronstadt Rebellion, so one of the same person. So in this way, by the beginning of 1921, there is a deep economical crisis. So the government sees that the current politics of direct expropriation of food from the village, from the peasant, doesn't work. And they start thinking about something new, something different. Important is that this is the beginning of relative peace. Yeah, so the intervention is over. The civil war is mostly over. And so March 1921 is the time when this policy is formally implemented by the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. Now I found some original documents, and I will just quote from one of them. This is a decree by FTSIK. FTSIK was the All Russian Central Executive Committee, the central legislative power in the country at that time. This is also of March 1921, which says that the kind of gist of the new economic policy is the substitution of the direct expropriation of this so-called продразверстка by taxation, which was meant to be the taxation in products. Yeah, so the financial system is also pretty much collapses at this time. There's a hyperinflation. The financial situation is not stable. There are no capital coming from abroad. Nobody invests in the country. And so this is the idea. So the idea is that the amount of agricultural product that was expropriated by special forces before will, which was very, very, very heavy, as I said, will be substituted by direct tax and taxation. So here I found a picture from that time. I'll show you. That's kind of was meant to explain how it is going to work. You know? So this explains that this is a new economic policy, which suggests that 20% of the product will be given directly to the state in order to be redistributed among the workers. Then 20% will be on the kind of limited market. Although initially Lenin and Trotsky were very uneasy about the idea of the market, but it was meant to be kind of exchange of industrial goods for agricultural goods. And then the remaining 60% will be left to the family of each producer, and everyone will be free to decide what to do and how to distribute this remaining 60%. So this was the main idea. And so the amount of the agricultural product that was taken in this kind of tax was considerably less than the previous one. So it was also this tax was also meant to be progressive. So the more you produce, the more you pay in this kind of taxes, which led to the creation of smaller enterprises, because in that way the tax was smaller. Now the taxation was individual. It's not kind of a group of people, but every producer was individually taxed, which was also something unusual, because quite often up to that time there were several economic forms of ownership, and sometimes peasants created some kind of cooperatives where they produced their product together with others. And yeah, so the idea was that in this way there will be it will become possible to create the kind of limited market for the exchange of agricultural goods for industrial goods. Now the problem is that the industrial goods were not readily available. They were not produced. There were not enough goods. And because the price for agricultural production was heavily regulated by the state, it led to the situation when the peasants stopped selling it on the market because the prices were very low, while the prices for industrial goods went up. This, in a few years, this created so-called scissors of prices, or price scissors, ножницы цен. This was the term introduced by Trotsky and became very kind of widespread, which meant that the relative price of industrial goods goes up and the relative price of agricultural goods goes down. Yeah. So the exchange rate of, say, bread for nails becomes very, to the disadvantage of the peasants. So this created a lot of problems. Another problem that everyone faced at that time was financial problems. So the finances were very much in disarray. So 1921 is also the time when the government starts working on a new currency. Yeah. 1922 is the introduction of so-called червонец, which is 10 golden rubles. So this is a famous ruble and 50 kopecks from the same time. So this is 1924 around this time. So on the top you have I have a ruble and so 50 half ruble on the bottom. And so the iconography, the images shows you the main idea behind NEP. On the top, you see that the peasants and the workers join their forces towards producing what they were meant to produce towards the common good. And on the bottom, this is 50 kopecks, so half ruble. You see a worker who is producing the corresponding goods. Now, so this created a new kind of class of so-called nepmans, were people who were engaged in the production of the goods. They were consistently undermined. So they, in many cases, they didn't have voting rights. They couldn't send their children to the same schools as other people. They couldn't legally publish their own newspapers or promote their views in any other ways. They couldn't serve in the army. They couldn't be members of trade unions, and couldn't serve in any capacity in the government. So the basis, this is something that you see in all the discussion of the time. The basis of industry was heavy industry, which of course needed a lot of financial support. There was not enough of them. 80% of the population were peasants. They created some product mostly in bread and grains, but this was not nearly enough of this new tax to cover the cost of the development of heavy industry. Now, as a result, this all led to a deep economic crisis. I mean, this disparity in the price of agricultural goods and industrial goods. In 1927, there was a deep crisis, and this is more or less over. So 1927, 28, the end of NEP. 1928 is the beginning of the first 5-year plan, Пятилетка, so-called. So the state begins moving from NEP at that time towards more centralized and planned economy. Although during this time, so as Andrew said, in early 1920s, there were a lot of interesting ideas floating around. For example, one of them was cooperation. This is a famous article, paper by Lenin, written shortly before his death. Was called on cooperation. So the idea was to promote cooperation. Now, one of the other people who stood behind the new economic policy was Osinsky, who in the 10th conference, not conference of the Communist Party, gave a speech which is not preserved. We don't have its text, but we know Lenin's reaction to it. And this reaction was kind of, could be summarized in three main theses: that this is really serious, that this is at least for 25 years, and this will be for a long time. So in his response, so there's these are famous words that later have been used quite often out of context, всерьез и надолго, so seriously and for a long time. That was what NEP, New Economic Politics, was meant to be. Now, if you look at Lenin's work, this is his short piece of October 17th, 1921, to this second Congress of Political Enlightenment, Politprosvet, so of the councils which were meant to spread, enlighten general public about current politics. He says that, first of all, we now understand that our previous politics was a mistake, that we cannot move to communism, to the way they envisage the way it will be directly. So the main idea of the new economic politics is really a substitution of the direct expropriation by tax, by taxation, which apparently should introduce free trade. And most of the leaders of the Communist Party, including Lenin and Trotsky, were not easy about the idea of the reintroduction of free market and free trade. It was originally meant to be on a very limited scale, kind of exchange one kind of goods for another kind of goods. This clearly, Lenin suggests that it would mean the reintroduction of capitalism in some limited form, the response to which was again the assertion of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now here the question is then what would be the role of the peasants in this new policy, because many people, for instance, Trotsky explicitly calls rich peasants the enemies of the new state. So what should one do with the peasants who are quite stratified? They're poor peasants, they're kind of middle class among peasants, and they are very rich. The top rich are about 5 to 10%. There's about a third of poor peasants, and everyone is somewhere in the middle. So for Lenin, still, this is a vital war. This is a struggle between capitalism that is coming back in a limited way, in this way, and the vision of the new society. Here he says, he formulates the task of the state. And state is also, as Trotsky says in his speech to the Fourth Congress of Comintern, Communist International in November 1922, that the main weapon of the new policy is the control of the state. Yeah, so the state controls state control over all economic activity. Now, Lenin also said that the state should be able to trade in such a way that industry satisfies the needs of the peasants, and the peasants satisfy the needs of the workers. And then he, at the end of his talk, this is Lenin still, he formulates a few urgent tasks. This is, again, very, very beginning of NEP. So he says that we have three main enemies. The first enemy is what he calls коммунистическое чванство, which is kind of communist conceit or arrogance, which means that, and this is also the task that kind of mentioned by Bukharin and Trotsky, that under war communism, in order to confiscate, expropriate agricultural product and redistribute it among the workers, but mostly among the soldiers in the army, you need a strong bureaucratic apparatus. Yeah, and of course it was mostly composed by people who belonged to the Communist Party. So becoming the communist became at that time a kind of almost a must for everyone who wanted to make a career under the new government. Hence, you have very big Communist Party. So Lenin said that we need to, the cleansing of the party of our ranks is something very important. And he mentions some 100 to 200,000 people that need to be cleansed from the party. So this is 1921. And we see that this task will become very urgent later, of course, with Stalin. So, so the party will be decimated. So this is the first enemy. The second enemy is illiteracy. Yeah. So this is also the task that was very much mentioned by Bukharin and by Trotsky, and namely kind of raising culture, what they used to say. So illiteracy was very widely spread. Again, most of the people in the country were peasants. Many of them were illiterate. Illiteracy among women was really more than 50%. And so the new state and the new, of course, economic politics will become only possible if we have well-educated workers, well-educated peasants. Now, one of the tasks that, for example, Trotsky sees is the necessity to bring in educated foreign specialists, mostly engineers, in order to grow industry. You need people who know how to do that. And the republics, the Soviet Republic doesn't have them, and therefore this was a very, very urgent task. So education of people, raising standards of culture. And the third enemy here, according to Lenin, is bribe, which he says is a widely spread phenomenon and which kind of corrodes the whole country and the whole industry from within. Lenin's talk is quite popular because it was meant for the people who didn't really know much about the intricacies of economics. So I will also say a few words about Trotsky's piece, The New Economic Policy of Soviet Russia and the Perspectives of the World Revolution, which he delivered, as I said, in November 14th, 1922, at the session of the Fourth World Congress of the Comintern in Moscow. He also goes through the concrete situation because, again, in order to understand this new economic policy, we need to understand that it was very concretely inscribed into political, social, and historical situation of the time. Here, Trotsky says, I quote him, the policy of confiscating the surpluses of the peasants, which was the idea behind war communism, led inescapably to a contraction, and decline in agricultural production. The policy of paying equal wages, so-called uravnilovka, when everyone is paid the same wage, no matter how much one produces and contributes to the production, led inescapably to the lowering of labor productivity. The policy of a centralized bureaucratic management of industry excluded the possibility of a genuine centralized management of fully utilizing technical equipment along with the available labor force. So by this time, most of heavy industry is nationalized. Land is nationalized. There is no private land at that time. All the railways belong to the state. All the big industrial enterprises become state property, and the credit system is also in the hand of the states. Now, the immediate steps on which most of the people agreed, and Bukharin followed this line, but he kind of stayed a bit away from this discussion, is that, I again quote Trotsky from his his talk. He says, only a mighty upsurge of state industry enabling it to provide the peasant and agriculture with all its requirements will prepare the soil for integrating the peasant into the general system of socialist economy. Technically, this task will be solved with the aid of electrification. So electrification is very, very important. Yeah. So since the peasants by that time didn't really see much of an advantage of joining this new system, the idea was that industry will give them something important in return for their product. And of course, what they needed were cloths and instruments, machines, which they were not able to buy readily because they were quite expensive. But at least the idea was that if the state gives free or almost free electricity to the country, then the country will be able to develop. So electrification is very, very important. The famous Lenin's slogan is that communism is electrification plus the Soviets, or Soviet power of the Soviets, which, I mean, when we were in high school, we invented a lot of formulas that derive from here, something like that electrification is a communism minus the power of Soviets. Anyway, so this was really, electrification was on everyone's mind. And then Trotsky again says that technically this task will be solved with the aid of electrification, which will deal a mortal blow to the backwardness of rural life. Yeah, indeed, the life was very backwards. There were almost no machines in the country. The muzhik's barbaric isolation and the idiocy of village life. But the road to all this is through improving the economic life of our peasant proprietor as he is today. The worker state can achieve this only through the market. This is Trotsky, which stimulates the personal and selfish interest, of the petty proprietor. The initial gains are already at hand. This year, the village will supply the workers' state with more bread grains as taxes in kind than were received by the states in the period of war communism throughout confiscation of the grain surpluses. The peasant is satisfied, and in the absence of normal relations between the proletariat and the peasantry, social development is possible in our country. This is, again, Trotsky. Now, where does it lead? Apparently, because the country is so poor, because everything, the industry lies in ruins, what one needs is the period of primitive socialist accumulation, which was meant to be propelled by the competition of state-run factories and plants. Here, again, when Trotsky speaks about of primitive socialist accumulation, he says our poverty in bread, in coal, locomotives, apartments, and so on, today assumes the form of scarcity in the means of circulation because we have shifted our economic life over to the foundations of the market. And this shifting was really kind of, people were very, I mean, the leaders of the Communist Party were very reluctant to do that. And the whole idea of the market didn't make them feel easy, and they only thought that this is not capitulation, but only a retreat. Yeah, our poverty in bread, in coal, locomotives, apartments, so on, today assumes the form of scarcity in the means of circulation because we have shifted our economic power to the market. Thereupon, heavy industry has been pointing enviously to the successes of fight industry. What does this mean? This means that with the incipient revival of economy, the available resources are being directed in the main where they are mostly urgently needed. That is, into those branches that produces goods for personal or productive consumption of workers and peasants. Business is now booming, and enterprises of this type, further, the state-owned enterprises are competing with one another. So this was the idea, that the state-owned enterprise will be competing with one another on the market, and in part they have to compete with private enterprises. So the market, which will remain the regulator of the state economy for a long time here, but obviously probably not forever, for a long time to come. And then he speaks again the idea of kind of state capitalism, because many people thought that this effectively introduces state capitalism. The response of Lenin and Trotsky and Bukharin to some extent, that it's not a state capitalism, it's only kind of provisional retreat. Now just a few of here, towards the end of his talk, Trotsky mentions that now in 1922, there are 4,000 state-owned and state-operated enterprises, which employ 1 million workers. And equally, there are 4,000 leased enterprises, capitalist enterprises, employing all in all 80,000 workers. So much less. So this means that the state enterprises, the average number of workers is 2,007 workers per enterprise, and in the lease, or this kind of limited capitalist enterprise, only 17, almost the same. However, he doesn't really mention the productivity of these enterprises. That will be, of course, very interesting thing to see. Well, anyway, so this, as I said, the main idea of introducing NEP was an attempt to revive economic life in the country, to make possible for this primitive accumulation under socialism, and introduce a limited market, which, as I said, didn't work. Although the whole economic life was very much revived, but still it led to a pretty substantial crisis in 1927, which then eventually led to the end of new economic politics and the introduction of very kind of heavy-handed direction of the entire economics by the state. I think I'll stop here at this point. Maybe you could.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. That was really wonderful presentation, and I think your knowledge of this, it's interesting how an insider who has lived there much of your life and learned it in a different way develops a perspective on this, which is certainly corresponds to many of the things that an outsider like me knows, but at the same time it is also different, and certainly the flavor of it is very different, which I very much appreciate, because I never actually heard someone from Russia or the Soviet Union to actually discuss this period. I heard many Western scholars at different times, and of course the literature on this period is very impressive. I'm not going to go through now a list of secondary authors, but students can get them from me if they are interested. So we're dealing with a very important stage in the history of Russia, and of course the Russian Revolution, but it is also a relevant event for the world in the sense that that the kind of discussion of what socialism is that was relevant to that period in Russia became relevant in lots of other places subsequently. I just mentioned that the mixed economy of the new economic policy is a kind of forerunner to market socialism, which exists in a lot of variants in Central Europe, Yugoslavia on one end, Poland on the other, very different, and yet in some respects having some similarities with itself. And as we have said in this class, the reform of Deng Xiaoping, coming in a very different context and a very different moment in history, also resembles in many ways the pattern of the new economic policy, with rather different results, which I think we will discuss with Ying Chen next time on Thursday. So this is a very important event, a very important period. And what is fortunate for us, though not the participants themselves, is the very high level of these participants. Lenin himself, serious writings on new economic policy and what to do once you have it. Bukharin, Preobrazhensky, Trotsky, Sokolnikov, and even much lesser names contributed. So it was a very high level of discussion, which I don't know if there's anything parallel in the history of market socialism, or for that matter, the Chinese reform. So it's really a very special event, a set of events in intellectual history. What makes it difficult for us to understand it is that there are really three levels of conflict which inform the discussion. One is the crises that you spoke about so well, which is something that everybody had to deal with in the period. It begins in a crisis, a huge famine. It has middle of the, or at least part of the road, it has this scissors crisis. I don't know the Russian names, and then ends with the goods famine, which is the way it is called in the West. So three really significant crises, and as you said, the last one is what leads beyond NEP in terms of the history of policy. But this is only one level. Another level is the factional struggles, which can only be interpreted in terms of Lenin leaving the scene. There were factional struggles before. Actually, Lenin participated in many of them. But his presence meant they could be resolved. There would be a final authority with sufficient prestige who could resolve them. Everybody remained in a party after Brest-Litovsk. Maybe they changed some positions. Everybody remained in the party during after the trade union debate. Everybody remained in the party after the debates about the workers' opposition. Of course, some positions were changed and exchanged. Some people were demoted, but there were no expulsions of at least the major major figure, which of course it was interesting in the context that there was increasing amount of repression against or outside of the party. That's one of the characters to think about the new economic policy, is that it is introduced at a time when democracy in Russian life on a political level is being reduced. In fact, for Lenin, these are even linked, I think, in his mind, because, and so for Bukharin and Trotsky too, because we can afford to experiment with a market setup with its decentralization because we are holding on to political power. So there was no question of surrendering the political power in 1921. Indeed, it was tightened so that after especially the death of Lenin, who could hold the group together, political democracy was very much reduced even within the party itself. So this is a second dimension, the conflict among the members, which then is linked to the third dimension, as I just mentioned, namely the democracy issue, which I think a lot of people have written about, and the weakening of democracy, even as public life in aesthetics, in film, in culture, is broadened. Sexuality too, in terms of everyday morals. This is a period of progress, yet political democracy is the one dimension on which there is not. Now, of course, NEP is above all about economics. And the final level of the struggle is about economic options, economic proposals. And there were genuine disagreements, even if the personal struggles to some extent interacted with the economic debates, and people took positions because they wanted to defeat someone else in the party. The debates were genuine, and they had to do with really two fundamental, or maybe three fundamental issues. The first one being, how do you interpret NEP itself? Is it a retreat, or is it an alternative road forward? And Lenin himself was torn on this particular question. You can find texts, which is why the various people would always look for them. You could find texts in Lenin, but it's a necessary retreat. We have to do it. To avoid the fate of Robespierre is a very interesting text toward the end of his life. But on the other hand, he also thought of it as a long-term strategy which will produce socialism. So this debate was one of the fundamental ideological differences. Another one, of course, had to do with the peasant. I don't know when Bukharin became friendly to the peasants, or even if he ever did in terms of his emotions, but certainly a significant group emerged within the party which became sympathetic and perhaps shocked by the war communist repression against this class. And there were people who were very consistent and traditional Marxists in this respect, who could not regard the peasant really as anything but an antagonist, even if not today, then tomorrow. And I think the left basically had this position. Trotsky certainly did. So there's a fundamental difference. And the third had to do with speed. I think they all agreed that you had to industrialize. I mean, no one thought you would be able to avoid you would be able to have socialism in a non-industrial country. So one of the things we had to do, given the fact that this was a peasant country, was to industrialize. But it remained a question, how fast and by what methods. Great thinkers of the debate divided on that. Slow on the one side, and using persuasion and attractive policies to bring everybody in, including the peasants. That's one end. And the other side was coercion, if necessary, and of course, repressing those who will fight it. Only that way could it be done fast. And I think both positions in that respect are coherent, because certainly persuading the peasants, who were already shocked by war communism and the requisition system you so well described, they were not going to be easily persuaded. That was going to take time. Education was going to take time, whatever. So consistently, the policy of an evolutionary line emerged that was more open to peasant accumulation. On the other side, they were consistent too. If you were going to do it fast, only coercion could be the method. Now, of course, it's not as if Preobrazhensky and Trotsky had Stalin's coercion in mind, although there is an argument to be made that only Stalin solved the coercion problem of how to actually do it, because doing it through taxes and doing it through price manipulation was not going to be fast either. But in any case, that's not what they had in mind, Stalin's coercion, but they did accept the idea of what they would have said, strong class struggle between workers and peasants. So this is where the differences lay. Now, to conclude, let me say, which is my judgment, but reading only the secondary literature, I have to admit that I have not done primary research on the time, is that I think both sides were right and both sides were wrong. Both sides were right against one another. In other words, the left could point out that a gradual system of development is going to be A, too slow in terms of generating the capital sums required, and B, it's going to create a class enemy that is not going to accept a socialist outcome unless it is eventually at some point imposed on it. So doing it gradually, Bukharin had in mind things like peasant accumulation through savings in the governmental savings banks. That's all possible, but it would be very slow and may not lead to the outcome given the transformation of the class structure. So the contradiction of the Bukharin position was ultimately that the slow process had uncertain future ahead of it. And secondly, he trusted perhaps the peasantry, or did not really understand how bitter the peasantry was as a result of the war communist experience. And in that sense, Bukharin promoted a perspective which may be attractive to a lot of people, certainly to Stephen Cohen, his biographer, and many others. It was the attractive option, but it would not have led to where even Bukharin himself wanted to go. On the left side, they were, as I said, right in pointing out the weaknesses of the Bukharin position. But they had a fundamental problem. Above all, Preobrazhensky, who was always a committed anti-bureaucrat, had it, and Trotsky eventually too, because he too wrote quite a lot on the Soviet thermidor carried out by the bureaucracy and Soviet Bonapartism carried out by the bureaucracy. Here the contradiction was that the method of development that they wanted, coercion, use of the state and its instruments, was incompatible with the diminishing of bureaucratic structures. In fact, it had to rely on them. What else was it going to rely on? Sure. So in a sense that Bukharin's contradiction was on a political level because his economic policy ran into his misunderstanding of the peasantry and its sentiments, its attachment also to private ownership. On the side of the left, the problem was that the kind of coercion which, after all, Preobrazhensky developed from his analysis of British and European history, in a sense that elsewhere primitive accumulation has also taken place without terror, that in the Russian context, where it was plagued by very high level of underdevelopment and where the need for speed was also exacerbated by the international threats to the Soviet Union, which were still quite possible. And of course, Hitler's invasion eventually showed that they remained even actual. In that context, it was impossible to rely on democracy, working class democracy, to achieve a primitive accumulation under those circumstances. And even in the British case, after all, it was not democracy that produced primitive accumulation, but the fairly oppressive strategies of the squires in the countryside, the rural landlords who gained from the enclosures and so on. In Russia, they didn't exist. There was no other instrument of coercion accept the bureaucracy, because the idea that the working class was itself the instrument of coercion against the peasantry was mythological. It wasn't organized on its own, it weren't enough, it didn't have the social power. So they were both right against each other, but on the other hand, neither proposed a model which was full of contradictions and difficulties. And even if we cannot say that the left, in a way, was the forerunner to Stalin's turn, still the contradictions of both of these positions, in a way, invited the laughing third to produce a solution where the other two could not. Now, Stalin wasn't able to do that because of his mastery of the internal bureaucratic struggle, which the others were not particularly good at and didn't really understand. But I don't think Stalin would have been possible had there been a truly viable option emerging from either the left or the right. And unfortunately, it was not there. So let me stop also at this point. Dmitri, if you want to say something more, it's up to you. Then we open it up to the class.
All right, thank you, Andrew. These are really very good and perceptive comments. Well, I agree with most of what you said. I think a kind of structural problem here was how to think about the interaction between the peasants and the workers. Okay, agricultural production and industrial production. As you said, Bukharin was really sympathetic with the agricultural workers, with the peasants. But this is an entirely different discussion, which I think is really central to the whole topic of what happened after the revolution, so how socialism was thought about, constructed. Because we know that, for example, social revolutionaries were much more popular among the peasants, because the idea was simply to take the land from the landowners and give it to the peasants, which didn't happen because under the Bolsheviks, land was nationalized, and I mean, the agricultural producers had to rent it from the state sometimes. I mean, quite to their disadvantage. And so, besides, this was the position of Trotsky, Lenin, and also later Stalin, that socialism should be based on a heavy industry, on industrialization. So the workers are those people who will be kind of locomotive. They will be promoting the new political agenda, and the peasants, they are kind of already suspect because they are owners. Maybe if they don't even all own the entire land, they own their means of production, they own their houses and so on and so on. So they have this vested private interest. And this is what, for example, Bukharin speaks about when he speaks about Kronstadt Rebellion. He says that, look, all these people, they mostly come from the army and they come from Ukraine. In Ukraine, you have much wealthier peasants, and therefore they are petty bourgeois, he says, and they are not able to understand the communist agenda. And so there was kind of perceived as a kind of almost class antagonism between the peasants and the workers. And again, the majority of the population were peasants. They were quite poor. And initially, they were indeed, many of them were very much supportive of the revolution, because Bukharin says explicitly that what we taught you, the peasants, meaning, is to go and kill the landowners and take their land from them. And I mean, this was an attractive slogan, because what people in the country, really peasants, needed was land. Yeah, they wanted to own it, to be independent producers, which did not happen. And so they, especially after all these very brutal repressions, and as you said, there was a lot of bitterness among them. For example, as far as I know, the first case of the use of chemical weapons against civil population was exactly in this Tambov uprising. Yeah, it was simply bombarded with chlor bombs, and they got choked. It was an absolutely terrible barbarian act. And this kind of acts didn't make, the policy of war, communism, expropriation very popular. And then, as you're saying, one really had to use some political means of persuasion that would attract this huge mass of agricultural producers on your side and allow you to follow, allow the leaders of the Communist Party at that time to pursue their way towards socialism, which they saw in heavy industry, which again couldn't be sufficiently supported by these new economic policies because it didn't simply generate enough of tax, enough of money to support this development. Moreover, some people mention, and this comes up in Bukharin and Lenin, for example, that some of the workers decided to abandon the city because it was very difficult to survive there at the time. There was a famine, shortage of food, and go to the village and establish themselves as independent producers of various things. Something that comes up all the time is lighter. They started producing lighters, which was something nice, but mostly useless for the production of big industry. And so it led to this kind of disintegration of industrial proletariat or industrial workers, which all the people who were needed in order to grow heavy industry. So all these were the kind of problems that the state faced and the people on the left of the faced, but they were not able to kind of address and solve them satisfactorily, which led to the, as I said, to the abandoning of this new kind of policy, new economic politics. By 1928, it was over, and then you have the very forced new chapter of collectivization, which was accompanied by also by the construction of the Gulag and by all these kind of very repressive measures.
You didn't mention socialism in one country, and it was a slogan already in the 20s. First, Bukharin used it. Is socialism in a underdeveloped, or rather in a country, possible? That's the question that you're touching on. And I think that from Marx's point of view, especially for Marxists, this becomes a great problem. Yep. Now, you mentioned the social revolutionaries, and I think they mentioned, they had an idea of a different kind of socialism. It wasn't a question for them of industrialize and reproduce kind of industrial apparatus capitalism has. They wanted to be based on the village. They wanted to be based on the village community, on the mir, the община, the very collective forms of farming that existed, or existed in the countryside too, producers, cooperatives. They decided about those options. But the Bolsheviks are Marxists. And even though Marx himself occasionally had some positive things to say about the община and so on, strong Marxists coming out of the tradition of social democracy did not. So for them, that was not a viable road.
Exactly.
Bukharin later on coined the right phrase for what they were doing. We had two revolutions, a potentially proletarian one and an anti-feudal one, he said. The anti-feudal one was the peasantry. That's what you just described as taking over the lands, killing the landlords, and taking their small plot by force. It wasn't distributed by the state even, although the state then confirmed it. They took it themselves. That's the anti-feudal revolution. These two revolutions, without it, there's no Russian Revolution. There's no Russian Revolution without the peasant soldiers, and no Russian Revolution without the agrarian movements in the countryside. So the Russian Revolution, Bukharin rightly saw, was two revolutions. what he did not see, and this is what Trotsky points out, that's what you're focus on just now, is that these two revolutions were contrary. They were not consistent with one another. Because in a Marxist sense, an industrializing socialist revolution was not compatible with the land being parceled out to small peasants who would shift to subsistence agriculture, right? Who would consume a lot of their product, and who, in any case, did not want to see that land lost. So, in a way, the critics, the Marxist critics of the Marxian revolution in Russia had a point that in Russia alone, it's not possible. Of course, Trotsky, with this idea of permanent revolution, wanted to solve this problem. But of course, that didn't work out because revolutions didn't happen elsewhere. So the dilemmas were very serious. And socialism in one country is one answer to it. But of course, it required coercive methods, because what Bukharin had in mind would not have produced socialism in one country, even though he used this term. Who knows what it would have produced?
Exactly.
So that's pretty much what. Anything more, or should we open it up to the?
Yeah, maybe just one observation,
Sure.
because in some parts of the country at the time, for instance, in Siberia, NEP produced a very widely spread cooperative movement among peasants, which was extremely successful. Actually, they were able to feed themselves, to produce a lot for export, for the inner market. But then there was a really crackdown on it in around 1928 with the forced collectivization, and many people who were involved said, well, why should we do this? Look, the cooperatives work very well. I mean, people are quite satisfied. They own their means of production. This is socially just. This is a kind of, you could say nowadays, democratic socialism. Why should we substitute with this kind of socialism top down? And as you say, really one of the important disagreements was ideological, because Trotsky, for example, then thought that heavy industry is the, and then Stalin, the foundation of socialism, that it has to be led by dictatorship of proletariat, that industrial workers should really pave the way for this kind of movement. And this is something that I kind of read maybe between the lines in this talk by Trotsky to the Comintern, where he basically rejects the idea of state capitalism, but then he kind of says that, look, this is a big agrarian country, and it was a very much feudal country in many ways, with very few industrial cities, centers. Otherwise, it was a huge peasant country with a very traditional, practically feudal system until 1961. And he kind of hints that, by reintroducing a limited or controlled capitalism in the Soviet Republic, we will introduce capitalism, but under our state control.
Right.
And then these, after that, so I mean, following the Marxist classical idea, then we will be able to conquer capitalism, fight with capitalism, and then move through socialism. This is something that kind of reads what Trotsky is saying here.
Trotsky, who in some ways the most sophisticated theorist, starts off with this problem you just mentioned, and then he says, well, we're going to have then two economies. One is the law of value, the other one is law of primitive socialist accumulation. They're going to each develop, but in the end, one or the other has to triumph. And he foretells struggles between these two economies. This is very early in new economic policy. But of course, the struggles could be said to have arrived with the goods famine, with the scissors crisis, because struggle need not be necessarily violence in the street. It can also be an economic one. And certainly, for example, Moshe Levin interprets these crises as peasant resistance, as forms of peasant resistance against the other logic.
Mhm.
So it was ultimately this idea of doing some socialism, doing some capitalism under our control was very unstable.
Yep.
So let's open it up to
Good.
the class.
Yes. Very good.
Thank you for both the talk and the comments. I have one question vis-a-vis the rental mechanism, the access to land, the access to the primitive primitive means of production, and economically, do we have statistics to check whether post-revolution and pre-revolution, if the Soviet economy kept working like in the feudal model, but you changed feudal lords instead of the big landowner, then you changed to the central government. Do we have economics to see what the rents were before and after? That would be something I would be very curious about.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. This is exactly the question I had, but I was not able to find any economic data, because the idea in this decree that I mentioned in the beginning is that we start with about 20% of taxation, which I think was kind of comparable to the feudal times. But then in reality, sometimes it was close to 30%. And then the idea was that it will be decreasing over the years, but it also will be progressive for big enterprises. So I don't have the numbers, but it's really worth looking into them.
But, you know, I think the numbers I've seen indicates, and you said this actually, that the time when the tax in kind, it's called, or tax in produce was introduced, this actually meant a dramatic lowering of what was taken in the requisition system. So initially, even though a tax was introduced and it probably wasn't loved, it was a huge improvement. Of course, it depended on the part of the country, depended on the efficiency of collection of either of the two things. But in macro terms, it was a real relief, and it was intended as such.
Yeah. I mean, this is with
so
regard to
initially it wasn't a problem, but of course,
yeah. Now, with regard to the war communists, of course, it was a relief. But the question was, in the feudal sort of times, whether the kind of taxation that the peasants had to pay to the landlord was similar, comparable. And I don't have the numbers, but this is a really good question.
You know, by this, you know, this is now the agrarian, you know, with the Stolypin reform, already a different kind of agriculture began. And so one would have to go way back. But I think with respect to the 19th century, I'm sure that the pressure on the peasant increased in this period.
Probably,
right?
yes.
So how much did it increase? Who knows? I just noticed in one of the texts, the word corvée is used. I don't know what the Russian term for that is. Apparently in the period of corvée, that's forced labor feudalism. That's a French term for it. I don't know what it was called in Russia. That you owed labor service to the landlord, not just tax. But there is also labor service in war communism. Because, for example, the militarization of labor meant that you actually requisitioned also laborers. You requisitioned laborers. So I think on that level, I think the real comparison, the real basis of comparison will be the short term, 20th century. And I think that probably the answer is that given the economic collapse, the first phase of the Soviet regime was much more extractive than anything that came before. But
yes,
we could try to look this up.
Yes, I think so. And this term is Russian is barshina. That's called. That's what the peasants were meant to do in labors. So
in Hungarian, it's called robot.
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 So it's weird, right? Because they take the Slavic word for work,
Yes.
right? Rabota.
Robota, yes.
And they make from Rabota a robot, which was the
Yes.
same as corvée. So every feudalism has it.
Exactly.
But, I'm sure that this didn't exist by the 20th century.
Yes.
And under the Soviet conditions, to the extent that they did this, it was, of course, I think that the evidence is that the peasants, and usually the literature distinguishes between kulak and middle peasant and poor peasant.
Yes.
There's no question that the rich peasant and the middle peasant did not like the regime.
Yeah.
Now, whether the poor peasants liked it or not is another question, because they did perhaps benefit from some of these redistributions and so on. But in general, I think the evidence is that the regime is not popular among the peasantry.
No. I think this
and the
is
fact that they lose,
important.
you mentioned the social revolutionaries. I mean, the peasantry had its own party. The destruction of that party for the educated part of the peasantry was a huge blow, right? And it wasn't the destruction. There was a big public trial of social revolutionaries, executions, exile, all the rest. So in a way, this was a very tense and conflictual relationship between the regime. I would not say workers and the peasants, because at some level, I don't see the evidence of a direct confrontation. Obviously, there was a direct relationship, because if you're hungry and a peasant is not delivering food, you probably have some problems with the people in the countryside.
Yeah.
But the conflict tended to be, when they went to requisition, they would take worker brigades.
Yes.
But these worker brigades were under party leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, they were not spontaneous workers coming out of the factory, going to the countryside to collect. These were mobilized. They were basically worker militias used by the party to go and collect. So I don't think it was a direct class conflict. It was a conflict between the party and the peasantry.
Yeah, another possible kind of solution to this problem was suggested by anarchists. Yeah? And in some parts of the country in that period, in Siberia, for example, or in Ukraine, anarchists were quite popular, because the idea that you organize a free cooperative or collectivity of free producers who own their product and then somehow exchange with a product that was produced by other cooperatives or other free people. So Makhno, for example, is a very interesting character who is mentioned, but rather
No problem. But the thing is that we tend to de-emphasize the cooperatives. This is strange, right? Because in the history of social democracy, for example, Bernstein talks about them. They existed elsewhere too. And obviously the populist movement in Russia, anarchists were connected to cooperatives. And Lenin's, one of his last articles is about cooperation, about the cooperative. And during the NEP, this was one of the legitimate property forms. Consumer cooperatives more than producer cooperatives.
Yeah, so financial cooperatives, all kinds of them.
And workers too, because there's a lot of cooperative production even on the level of factories. Artel was the old institution, but it was renewed. But I think because of collectivization, all this, we sort of forget that there was another option, which exists elsewhere too. Cooperatives exist in capitalist countries too. Maybe the idea, the fear was on the part of the Bolsheviks that the cooperatives would always involve markets, because they would always interact with other cooperatives, other producers in terms of market relations. So ultimately, cooperative was seen in the Marxist idea as a capitalist form. It wasn't seen as a socialist form. But it's a very bad thing to neglect, and I'm very happy you brought it up.
Yeah, but
referring to Lenin's last one of his.
Yeah, but with anarcho-communists, for example, or say Kropotkin, Makhno, the idea was the abolition of the state altogether. This was also a kind of Lenin's idea that eventually state will go, and then anarchism and communism will become indistinguishable. But at this point, everyone stresses, for example, Trotsky stresses that the strong state is a huge advantage because it will in the end be able to dictate the will of the workers to everyone else. So that
maybe this is the link why the thing really had to fail, because in the situation of disorganization following the revolution, following the civil war, following even the conflict of the two classes and the bureaucracy and the idea that you're going to have you're going to start reducing and weakening state power was not easy to represent.
Yes.
And it may very well be that the very creative economic ideas of the very same people were not taken seriously enough because of their relationship to the state and to politics. I mean, obviously Marxism is anarchist in terms of the ultimate goal, but in terms of the transition, Marx himself accepted the idea of a strong state power.
Of course.
So here Marxism and anarchism are so opposed that the Bolsheviks were not open. And anarchism is almost always a dirty word in their language. Anarchism is never positive, the way they saw it.
I was thinking about foreign trade right during this time. When the Soviets Bolshevik Sovietized Georgia, for instance, this in 21, Lenin allowed somehow trade with foreign countries. It was kind of transitional measure, you know. So is it somehow connected with this idea of economic, like a net, because market allowing some kind of trade connection with Turkey, for instance. And another question is about the antagonism of workers and peasants, and eventual dekulakization in a later time. And sometimes, and in some cases, in Soviet republics, this issue was connected with national issues also. Somehow, not just like a class kind of understanding, but also this was attached with a national color also. And there was uprising in Abkhazia, for instance. Peasants had an uprising against this collectivization, and there was a severe, treatment of these people. So, do you think that this antagonism led destroying these peasants as a major class was connected some kind of national issue, and national issue was used as a means of class struggle in a Soviet context? Thank you.
Yeah, Dmitri, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is an interesting question, because in the context of the debates about NEP, I read kind of the issue of nationalities is not really raised. It's here is much more kind of class struggle, against bourgeoisie, and so the idea is that the interest of the class of the workers or the peasants is kind of universal. It doesn't really depend on the national background or particular situation. So I of course, in some cases it could become an issue, but at least it was not meant to be that way. But this is interesting, important question that needs a really very concrete kind of historical, sociological, and political analysis. Now, as for the foreign trade, again, it was all centralized by the state. Trotsky, for example, explicitly says that all finances are centralized by the state. All foreign trade was, again, in the hands of the state, which through it received some currency to develop heavy industry and machinery. At that time, they basically sold everything that could possibly sell, not only grain produced by the peasants. I mean, industry didn't really produce much at that time that could be sold on the international market, but they, for example, sold a substantial part of the art collection from the Hermitage. Yeah. So one small, very nice triptych of Van Eyck that you nowadays see here in Metropolitan Museum. This is one of my favorites. Well, used to be part of the collection of Hermitage. Was sold, I mean, really in order to raise enough money to build in industry. So, Andrew, do you have any insights into this?
You know, we neglected the nationality issue, which has even been called by Moshe Lenin's last struggle, right? I mean, the struggle over Georgia and what kind of role the Central Party would play with respect to Georgian institutions, both party and Soviets. This was perhaps as important at a certain point as the economic debates in your economic policy. But I think both the Ukrainian and the Georgian independence within the party and the Soviets lost. And so I think that we don't pay so much attention to the republics, even after 22 when the Soviet Union is constructed, because we kind of think that the central organization dominated all the areas. This, I think, may be a mistake, because even if one is thinking about the complexity of this country, Ukraine being in some ways more Western, more developed, there are the Asian republics, Muslim republics, which are agricultural and even nomadic in part. The country is so complex that could all the issues we discuss apply to all of them in a similar way. You mentioned Siberia, which was traditionally thought of as an area of relative freedom, in spite of the fact that the gulags were there and all the rest, but still the people there who were independent and not imprisoned had a great deal of territorial and even political freedom, even in the Tsarist period, probably. So I think that in a way, the question is right, that we really should be able to consider, but we can't, because I don't even know if anybody has studied the fate of these debates in the different republics. But it's certainly a very interesting question. And of course, we see how serious these issues remain, because once the power of the center is removed, the republics become independent. So in that way, their specificity and their difference must have been an important matter to them. They became Russified in some way because everybody learned the language, but they didn't become really Russians in the cultural sense, unless, of course, the people who were transported there. So it's an interesting question, and Makhno's history indicates this too, because Ukraine is a center of anarchism because in some ways it is politically more connected to other countries further to the west. So it's and even Kronstadt. I mean, this is an interesting issue, whether it is really true that the sailors were the Ukrainians.
That's what Bukharin said.
That's what they said. That's what they said. But certainly, you know, they were always, through the whole period, the advance guard of the revolution. A very sophisticated anarchist and left socialist milieu. It's just a small city, but it was different than other parts of Russia. So I think that in that sense, well, of course, under Stalinism, all this becomes moot. But in the 20s, it must have mattered.